the last major component of this theory of meaning making in the world. So literacy was about the business of written text in the world in its traditional forms, right? But in the world today, what we find is this extraordinary mix of modes, and what we've done is we've built a classification scheme of modes of meaning, which we've represented here in this diagram. And in fact, if we really think hard, that not only does this represent the kind of complex meanings that happen in the world of new media, digital media, the internet today, and therefore that means that we have to expand our notions of literacy. But in fact, even traditionally, there were all kinds of relationships. In other words, written meanings were also spatial, spoken meanings were also had an audio component, which is prosody, that often there was gestural meanings closely connected, for example, in theatre and drama. So even in traditional genres of literacy, the monomodal, alphabetical reading and writing view of literacy was excessively narrow. But in this era, it's just crazily narrow in terms of the transformations we've seen over the last couple of decades, particularly around the emergence of digital media. So we've built here this kind of schema, and what we've done, I'm going to go around each of the modes in this circle now and discuss them. What we've done is we've deliberately separated oral and written meanings because they are unbelievably different. So one of the real problems with teaching phonics in a rule-bound kind of way, it assumes that the relationship between orality and literacy, between writing and speaking, is simply a transliteration of speech. Well, it's not. If you went back and parsed what I've just said, and I'm not speaking to a written script, I'm speaking to these diagrams, I'm speaking conversationally, there are no sentences. There would have been sentences if I was reading a script, but I'm not. There are no sentences. It's just a crazy jumble of clauses, one after the other, a bit redundant, a bit chaotic, because that's what all the mind can do if you're just speaking, if you're not reading a script. Reading a script's a different exercise, by the way. That's simply reading out writing. That's not really oral language. So anyhow, if you do that, there are no sentences, there are no paragraphs. It's just this kind of, and also it's very, very redundant. When we write, we carefully don't repeat things. We look back over what we've done. It's very concise. It's tight. It's well structured. Orality, in its nature, because it's ephemeral. It disappears on us. Can't be well structured. It's sort of rambling and repetitive, and that's what orality is like. So one thing we want to do is say, look, the grammar of orality and the grammar of literacy are very, very different from each other, as different as the other modes, which I'm going to speak about in a second. And in fact, that's why, in some senses, orality is close to audio, and in some senses, written is close to visual. And the differences are there are as many similarities and differences as there are between oral and written.
If we take seriously that meaning making happens through oral meaning making, through written meaning making, visual meaning making, spatial, gestural, and audio, what meta language do we have for understanding the patterns that emerge in those spaces? We have a meta language for a linguistic meaning making, and we call it grammar. But what is possible for us? How do we enable a learner to see the relationship between the different modes and the peculiarities within each mode? Now, the way we do it is to ask 5 questions about meaning of each of those modes. First of all, the first question is, whether it's oral or written or visual or spatial or gestural or audio, what do the meanings refer to, right? What is in that space? Secondly, we talk about how the meanings, the second question is, how do meanings connect those interacting in the oral communication or the written communication or the visual or the spatial or the gesture? What is the interaction between those who are involved in the meaning making? The third question is, how does the overall meaning hang together? That is, what is the composition? Again, whether it's oral or written or visual or some mixture of those, how do the components sit together in order for that meaning to be made. And the fourth question, in what context or situations are the meaning located? So context is very important. Is it a historical context? Is it, a science context? Is it a physical environment? The context really matters. And the fifth question matters equally. What is the purpose of the meanings? And more importantly, whose interests do they serve? So these 5 questions are questions that can be asked of each of the modes, whether it's spoken, whether it's written, whether it's visual, spatial, gestural, audio, or a mixture of those. It allows us to come up with the patterns that enable us to understand how something was constructed in order to have a particular impact or meaning.
What we do in the world now is this extraordinary close relationship of written and visual. And it wasn't the case until recently that we had this close relationship. And I'm going to give a very kind of narrow technical reason as to why these things have become closer together. They've become closer together because they can now. So when the printing press was first invented, the technology of letterpress printing, which is basically character after character on a form, and you build up the form and you print onto a piece of paper, was different from the technology of lithography, which is printing images. And therefore, you might remember in old-fashioned books, there was a section in the book which was on special paper using lithographic printing techniques, which was the plates or the pictures, and other sections in the book which were the writing. They had to be sort of kept separate just for simple technological reasons. Another technological example is when analog television was invented. It wasn't that easy to put writing on the screen, to be quite frank, and it had to be done, maybe you could do a title up the front. It was a fair bit of work, and the technology of putting writing onto the screen and having image on the screen, they were different technologies. And it really wasn't until digitization that it became easy and possible to overlay screens with texts. So television today, if you look at the sports channels or the business channels, the news channels, a crazy amount of writing going on those screens, which just wasn't feasible before. So that world of writing and image is coming closer and closer and closer together. Of course, on the internet, look at image and text. On social media, Twitter, Facebook, look at the relationship of image and text. They're very, very close in a way that they weren't until recently. And in fact, look, an interesting, very, very small, interesting footnote is that this actually started to begin began in the 20th century with the invention of photolithography and printing. So in other words, then it became possible to put image and text with phototypesetting onto the same plate when you're printing. So actually, some of this movement predates the digital, but the digital intensifies it a hell of a lot. Now, what a strange thing to have a subject called literacy where we strip out the visual, where we're on about just writing. Okay, and of course, when we come to do writing in history or in social studies or in science, we need images. There's something missing if you can't put in a diagram, if you can't put in a video which illustrates what you're doing in an experiment in the middle of the write-up the experiment. There's something missing if you can't put in visual representations of data with the data. So, in other words, to be an effective communicator or an effective, even to represent this stuff to yourself effectively these days, these texts need to be multimodal in which image and text are closely related. So we've got to change what we do in literacy. The other modes there that we talk about is spatial, so that when you're in a lecture theatre as opposed to having a conversation with somebody in a cafe, these are linguistic spaces, but they're linguistic spaces which are completely framed in their form by space. Tactile means that we're all the time, using objects. In other words, I'm looking now at a camera. In order to use this camera, we read instructions, we move things around. That our relationship, even in terms of the media with which we represent ourselves, is that we use objects. And by the way, we always have. Last few days I read this fascinating history about the movement from the fountain pen to the ballpoint pen and what that did for writing pedagogy. So in other words, these objects that we use even for representation and communication are an integral part of our lives and to some degree shape what it is we do and how it is that we do it. Gestural meanings, which is, look, here I am in a video, I'm using my hands, goodness only knows, people have parsed what all this funny hand movement stuff means, but it was always a big part, of course, of theatre and of dance, but gestural meanings become very important when we build videos, when we represent stuff in video, and that it's hard to separate our bodily personas, what we dress, the way we appear, the way we carry ourselves, our demeanour. Bourdieu's word is habitus, our kind of bodily presence in the world. It's hard to divorce that now, and in fact it's always been hard to divorce it from the meanings we make in the world, the way in which we represent ourselves to ourselves and the way in which we communicate with the world. And finally, audio meanings, which is all the dings and sounds on our computers, music, the prosody in language, the tone in which we speak, and it, again, very closely aligned with the world of orality.